Hi, everyone, and welcome to Historiography. My name is Devin, and I will be your instructor this semester. Uh, for most of you, this is probably your first foray into the graduate world of history, um, and this can be a pretty intense one. Historiography is a subject that, at the undergraduate level, I find is not terribly emphasized, and that can make it a real abrupt departure to suddenly go from kind of that approach of, well, history is about looking at sources, studying them, and presenting information about the past, to first the focus on original arguments, that your job is not to write a history paper just to tell me what Constantine did. Historians know that, to a large extent at least. Your job is to find gaps in the historiographic record to add something that isn't known or isn't well understood or is misunderstood in the field. And one of the key building blocks of that is historiography. Now, one of the things I found, and I know I had this coming from my background is in political science and telecommunications. My interest was always has always been in some aspect the social effects of media. And when I first came into history and kept hearing about historiography, I immediately tried to figure out what the heck it was, and I couldn't really get a good answer. Probably took me 2 or 3 semesters to fully grasp what it meant, simply because I needed it in, I don't know, I guess what I would call plainer language. And in that, I would say, above all else, when you think about historiography, you do it all the time when you write a history paper. You are engaged in historiographic study because you are looking at the work that's already done on the subject. Now, in this course, eh, basically that's where we stop. We stop studying the work that's already been done. We don't then take that as a basis to present something new to the reader or to like integrate it into a broader understanding, which is, I think, what you're kind of instinctively trained to do with this type of work. Um, I think that's one of the reasons why I and I think many others struggle with historiography, that it feels naturally incomplete. That you've studied the history of the historians that have written on this subject, but you're not doing something with it. You're just focused on presenting the understanding of that to your reader. Um, so, one of the things you may find fighting in this course is that desire to do more than historiography. But ultimately, that's where we need to keep the focus. So, in a nutshell, just think about historiography is the history of everything historians have written on your subject or individual or whatever the focus might be that you're studying at a given moment. So, if I wanted to write an unique argument about Constantine, what would I first need to do? I need to know what's been written on him first. Otherwise, I don't know if what I'm doing is unique or not. So, in a sense, just by doing that, I've engaged in a historiographic study. But in most cases, I would say we don't write about it. I mean, it will become a part of our papers. We'll present the background information before we get into original argument, but we don't consciously think about it as historiographic work. But that's what it is. So whether your experience is in history or another discipline, more than likely you have already engaged in plenty of historiographic work because you have studied the existing sources on a subject in order to get a good grasp of that so you could understand what you could do to add and help grow that field or subject. So don't fret too much about the fancy term historiography is unto itself. It is basically the research process. You're just being a lot more methodical in terms of laying out the research project in a historiography that you're doing, and you're being a little bit more critical. Again, stuff that you would do in your head, but you wouldn't really think about in explicit terms. So, an historiographic study of oh, what would be a good example? I'm trying to think of something more contemporary. Well, let's say civil rights. Civil rights is certainly an issue that's addressed right now. If I'm looking at the historiography of the civil rights movement, one thing I might find is that, let's say we start at works from the 1960s. If that's really where probably the 1950s would be the origin of the first real historical explanations of the modern American civil rights movement, should be specific. Um, I would probably find civil rights was very narrowly focused on the African American experience. Then I would start to find, as the scholarship grew, Mexican Americans would become an increasing focus. Women would become more recognized as within the context of civil rights. Non-heteronormative groups would be increasingly recognized, so on and so forth. That the field expands and evolves over time, basically. I mean, fields change over time. If any field is static, that should raise alarm bells unto itself because that shouldn't really happen. Um, so when you're doing this type of historiographic work, you're looking for trends, changes. Uh, the older a history you're studying, and that historians have been looking at for longer, the more you would expect big shifts to come, say when social and cultural history become introduced, when gender gets introduced. Even, I mean, if you go way back, let's say ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, ancient Chinese, uh, when traditions in Western historiography change, you would expect the historiography itself to shift directions too. Once the Enlightenment and scientific revolution happened to create kind of the foundations for modern Western historiography, you see a shift from the more focus on chronology into historical analysis and eventually to a greater emphasis on objectivity. Um, you may find when you study your subjects, though, that what is claimed to be objective sure doesn't look all that objective in the end. Like, boy, this looks really sexist, this looks really racist, so on and so forth. Don't be surprised by any of that either. When you really, really start to deconstruct these sources to see the nature of the information they're presenting and how, I think that's one of the greatest values of historiography, to realize just how much messaging and meaning is contained in what historians cover, what they don't, the language they use to cover their different subjects, like how are women treated, particularly in older historical sources, often mocked and denigrated. You find a lot, which perhaps can also help you understand where history is and who it doesn't impact today. So I hope, as a starting point, again, for many of you into this program, and for others still fairly early on, that don't be too intimidated about historiography in terms of what it is, because again, you've done it anyway. But that what this course hopefully will really help you do is uh, evolve and improve that critical eye you already have towards history, to really be able to look at how a historian approaches their work, how they justify their thesis. And remember, a thesis is always biased, so there's always a degree of bias in history. But ideally, that bias is supported by a whole lot of evidence that isn't obviously manipulated towards a particular end of supporting that thesis at the cost of, well, facts. Um, but that this course is really going to help you be able to walk through sources to understand what you see as their strengths and weaknesses, and strengths and weaknesses in terms of approaches in the field. This may teach you that, wow, I really think cultural history is a great way to approach the study of the past. It can add a lot. Or you may find, definitely political history is the lens for me if I'm in terms of how I'm going to understand the past. That this course should really help you understand who you are as a historian and what and how you're going to be able to offer um, the discipline through your own work over time. So basically, the major focus is the project. Um, Again, I've got a video to walk through that, and I walk through historiography more there. So watch that over. That'll help you get a sense of where the class is going. All the discussions otherwise are basically geared towards further driving home the idea of what historiography is, um, and where it fits into your own work, both for the project, but your own work as a future historian as well. So, all right, that's all I have for right now. Anybody has any questions about anything, of course, let me know. Otherwise, we'll use the first discussion board to get to know each other better and kind of work into the course from there. So I look forward to getting to know everybody this week. Any questions about any aspects of the course, as always, just drop me a note, let me know. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, I will talk to everybody on the boards.